There's a quiet tyranny in good enough. Not bad, mind you. Not outright rot, just good. It wraps around you like a familiar blanket, comfortable, predictable. And that's where the danger lies, see, because sometimes good ain't doing you any good at all. Sometimes good is just the comfortable cage you build for yourself, brick by safe, dependable brick, until you wake up one morning and realize you're staring out at a world you never truly lived in. Take a man like Hank. 48 years old, steel dust and the faint scent of hydraulic fluid practically etched into his skin. He worked at the Westlake manufacturing plant, same place his old man punched the clock, same place a lot of men in his town had grown old and gray. His face wasn't lined from laughter much, more from squinting at gauges and the kind of worry that digs in slow and deep, like rust on an old engine. You might not notice him in a crowd, not at first. He wasn't loud, never had a flashy story to tell at the bar, just a quiet nod and a thoughtful sip of his beer. But if you paid attention, if you really looked, you'd see it. His hands now, those were a story in themselves. Calloused and thick, knuckles a little swollen from years of wrenching and lifting, from hauling and pushing. They were the hands of a man who'd built things, fixed things, provided things. Strong hands, no doubt, but they carried a weariness you could almost feel if you watched them rest after a long shift. And his eyes. They were a muted blue, usually observant, taking in more than he let on, missing precious little. But sometimes, especially when he thought no one was looking, a flicker of something else would cross them, a ghost of a dream perhaps, or a quiet regret, quickly shuttered away like a window against a cold draft, before it could ever take root or be truly seen. Hank was the kind of man who never chased the spotlight, never rocked the boat. If there was a good deal to be had, a safe bet, he took it. A steady job? Good. A reliable house, even if it was smaller than he'd hoped, settled into an older, working-class neighborhood with a neat, modest yard. Good. A life that offered stability, even if it felt a little confined. Yeah, that was good enough for Hank. For most of his life, good enough was the safest bet, the sturdy anchor in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. He believed in earning his keep, in providing for Susan, his wife, and their 2 kids, Emily and Daniel. That was his purpose, his North Star, and good enough seemed like the straightest path to it. He'd seen friends chase big dreams, bigger paychecks, a shinier life. Some hit it big, sure, the lottery winners, the lucky ones who stumbled into fortunes. But more often, he'd watched them crash and burn, losing everything they'd built, leaving their families scrambling. Hank wasn't built for that kind of gamble. He remembered the recession back in '08, how it ripped through the town like a sickness. Companies folding, houses foreclosing, neighbors packing up their lives in the dead of night. He'd kept his head down then, held onto his job by a thread, and promised himself he'd never put his family in a position where they might lose what little they had. That fear, it was a constant hum beneath the surface of his calm exterior, a quiet undertow guiding every decision, making every safe bet feel like a hard-won victory. The modest, single-story house on Elm Street, with its tidy lawn and the swing set in the back that Emily and Daniel were rapidly outgrowing, was proof of that philosophy. It wasn't the biggest or the newest, no grand entrance or sprawling acres, but it was theirs. Paid off, almost. Same with his beat-up pickup truck. Reliable, not flashy, got the job done without complaint. Susan, his wife, a woman with a quick, warm laugh and worry lines that sometimes mirrored his own, understood. She'd always been his steady ground, the one who didn't push, who just was, a calm harbor in their often turbulent world. Their daughter, Emily, 16 now and all elbows and bright ideas, was starting to look at the world with a wider lens, asking questions Hank sometimes struggled to answer. Daniel, 12, still mostly absorbed in video games and scraped knees, but growing fast, too, and already needing his dad for more than just fixing his bike. They were his world, his reason for everything. For years, Hank had navigated life like a careful captain steering a freighter through known waters. He knew the channels, he understood the currents, he kept an eye on the weather always. Deviating from the path, even for the promise of a faster, more exciting journey, felt reckless, irresponsible. He'd chosen stability over opportunity time and again, convinced he was doing the right thing, convinced that good enough was not just the safest choice, but the smartest choice. It was a philosophy carved into the very marrow of him, an unspoken creed that had defined his life up until this point. He was a man who understood the value of a sure thing, even if that sure thing meant leaving a part of himself, a small, hopeful part, perpetually unfulfilled. They say good things come to those who wait, and sometimes they do, but sometimes what comes is just good, not great, not what your heart truly yearned for, just good, and a man can get awfully comfortable with good, can't he? So comfortable he forgets what better even looks like, starts to believe good enough is all there ever will be. He builds a life around it, brick by careful brick, convincing himself that stability is the highest prize, even if the foundation feels a little hollow sometimes. He tells himself he's wise, that he's practical, that he's protecting his own, when maybe, just maybe, he's only protecting himself from the terrifying prospect of reaching for something more. Hank at 48 knew a lot about good enough. He was one of those men you see every day, blending into the backdrop of 1,000 factory towns. His frame, still sturdy but with the permanent forward lean of someone who'd spent decades hoisting heavy things, didn't draw attention. His uniform, a faded blue work shirt and sturdy jeans, carried the ghost of grease stains even after a wash, a silent testament to the daily grind. He wasn't flashy, never had been. His hair, once a sandy brown, was now mostly gray, cropped short and practical like everything else about him. There was a quiet strength in his shoulders, a sort of immovable presence, but if you looked closer, especially at the corners of his mouth when he wasn't smiling, you'd catch a hint of weariness that went bone deep. His hands, though, those were his storytellers. Thick-knuckled and calloused, crisscrossed with tiny scars and ingrained lines, they were a roadmap of every wrench turn, every heavy lift, every hour clocked in at the plant. They told of a life spent building and repairing, providing and protecting. And his eyes, a faded blue, held a quiet sort of resignation, a patient endurance, but every now and then, if you caught him just right, there was a flicker, a distant memory of a younger man who dreamed bigger, before life had taught him the wisdom of settling. He rarely offered a soft smile, but when he did, it could surprise you, a brief flash of warmth that softened the edges of his gruff exterior. His world began with the shrill, unapologetic blare of his alarm clock at 5 a.m. 5 days a week, sometimes 6, that sound ripped through the lingering tendrils of sleep, pulling him from dreams he could never quite remember, but often felt sweeter than waking. The worn linoleum of the kitchen floor was cold beneath his bare feet as he shuffled for the coffee pot, the first ritual of a day built on repetition. Susan would still be asleep, a soft, familiar curve beneath the quilt, and the kids, Emily and Daniel, were deep in their teenage and preteen slumbers. He liked these quiet hours before the house stirred to life, before the demands began. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the yellow glow of the overhead light illuminating the steam rising from his mug, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirping of early birds. It was his brief sanctuary before the real world intruded. Then came the factory. Same parking spot, same clanging gates, same smell of ozone and hot metal that permeated everything, clung to his clothes, his skin, his hair. He walked the same path through the bustling floor, past the roaring presses, the rhythmic thump of the assembly line, the constant, deafening symphony of industry. He knew every bolt, every lever, every worn section of the concrete floor in his department. His job, operating and maintaining a series of hydraulic presses, was precise, demanding, and utterly monotonous. Hour after hour, he'd feed sheets of steel into the maw of the machines, watch the dies descend with a thunderous thwack, and pull out the newly formed parts. Repeat, repeat again. His body moved with an almost automatic efficiency, his mind often drifting, sometimes to a half-forgotten memory, sometimes to a half-formed worry. Money, or the lack of it, was a constant undercurrent. Every paycheck, Hank would sit down at the kitchen table, usually Friday evening, bills fanned out like a bad hand of cards. Mortgage payment, car insurance, utility bills that seemed to creep higher with every season. Then there were Emily's braces, Daniel's new hockey gear, the endless grocery list that seemed to grow faster than he could pay it down. Susan worked part-time at the local diner, just enough to help keep their heads above water, but not enough to ever truly get ahead. They weren't poor, not by the standards of some, but they were perpetually treading water, always a broken appliance or an unexpected medical bill away from going under. He'd tally the numbers, pencil scratching against paper, the small stack of cash for household expenses dwindling far too quickly. Each month was a careful dance, a delicate balance of wants versus needs, and needs always won. This cycle, this perpetual state of just enough, had etched itself into his very being. It was this relentless pressure, this constant financial tightrope walk that had fueled his philosophy of good enough. He'd seen friends take risks, chase big dreams, only to crash and burn, losing everything. He couldn't afford that. Not with Susan, not with Emily and Daniel depending on him. He remembered the time a buddy from the plant had talked him into investing in a local startup, a small carpentry business. Hank had pulled out at the last minute, the fear of losing their meager savings a cold knot in his stomach. The business had failed within a year. He felt a grim vindication then, proof that his caution was justified. But then there was the other side of the coin. The opportunity to go to night school for an engineering certificate offered by the plant 10 years ago, a chance at a supervisory role. He'd turned it down, citing family obligations, the extra shift work he needed for a new water heater, convinced the time wasn't right. That spot had gone to Frank Peterson, who now drove a new truck and talked about sending his kids to college without a second thought. Frank, who had started on the same line as Hank, but had dared to take a step, however small, away from good enough. These buried dreams, these quiet what-ifs, nodded Hank, sometimes just a dull ache, other times a sharp pang of regret in the silent watches of the night. He saw the gap between who he was and who he had wanted to be. Not a CEO, not some high-flying executive, but simply a man with a little more freedom, a little more say in his own destiny, a little less worry etched into Susan's face. He wanted to be able to tell Emily when she asked about her future to chase her biggest dreams, not just the safest ones. He wanted to look at Daniel and know he was setting an example of courage, not just caution. But the truth was he felt stuck, trapped in the routine, the monotony, the comfortable cage of good enough that he himself had meticulously constructed. He often wondered if he'd chosen stability so many times that he'd forgotten how to even imagine something better, forgotten how to swing for the fences instead of just trying to get on base. That small, hopeful part of him, the one he'd continually pushed down, was still there, barely breathing, a faint ember under layers of ash. He carried a silent shame, a knowing that he was capable of more, had once desired more, but had systematically chosen the path of least resistance, the path of certainty, even if it led to a quiet, unremarked life. He was resilient, yes, hardworking, fiercely loyal, pragmatic, but also a prisoner of his own fear. And every morning when the 5 a.m. alarm screamed its demands, that fear was the first thing to greet him, a silent partner in his careful, unfulfilled life. That insistent, buzzing shriek ripped him from a shallow sleep, every morning the same invasion. Hank slapped at the clock radio, silencing the beast, then lay there in the dark, blinking. 5 a.m., always 5 a.m. The room was cold, the digital numbers on the clock glowed an angry red. He pushed himself up, the mattress springs groaning a complaint that mirrored his own. Susan was already in the kitchen, a silhouette in the dim light, the soft hiss of the coffee maker a comforting counterpoint to the alarm's recent aggression. Hank poured himself a mug, the rich, bitter smell a jolt to his senses. He liked his coffee strong, black, no nonsense. Just like he liked his mornings, quiet and predictable. Soon, Emily would pad in, 16 years old, already taller than Susan, perpetually glued to her phone even at this ungodly hour. Daniel, 12, would follow, usually a little more groggy, a little more prone to spilling his milk. Hank watched them, his daughter with her quick wit and burgeoning independence, his son with his boundless energy and endless questions. He'd offer a gruff, loving word, a pat on the shoulder, a shared laugh over a silly joke Daniel had heard. These small moments before the world truly woke up were the anchors of his day, brief islands of peace before the grind. He'd leave the house while the stars were still out, the air crisp with the promise of a cold autumn day or thick with the oppressive humidity of summer. His old Ford truck, faithfully maintained, rumbled to life with a familiar cough. The drive to the factory was a blur of familiar turns, streetlights painting fleeting halos on the wet asphalt, then giving way to the sprawling, impersonal industrial park. For 25 years, it had been the same route, the same destination. Precision parts manufacturing. The factory floor was a symphony of clamor and industry, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulic presses, the rhythmic thud of machines that never seemed to tire. Hank's corner of this metallic jungle was assembly line B7, where he'd been for the last 15 years, putting together components for hydraulic pumps. A good job, steady work, good benefits. That's what he told himself. That's what he told anyone who asked. But the truth was, his hands moved with an practiced monotony that felt less like skill and more like a surrender. Twist, bolt, check, repeat. Thousands of times a day. His mind, however, was rarely on the task. It was usually on the numbers, always the numbers. The mortgage payment due on the 3rd, the gas bill that had climbed last month, the cost of groceries that seemed to increase every time Susan came home from the store. Emily would need new glasses soon. Daniel was growing out of his shoes every 6 months. He'd run the calculations in his head, a constant, low hum of financial anxiety. There was always enough, just enough, to keep the wolf from the door, to keep the modest, well-kept single-story house in the older working-class neighborhood from feeling too cramped, too threadbare. But just enough left no room for error, no space for dreaming. He'd catch glimpses of himself in the reflective surface of the metal panels he assembled, a man with dust-fine lines around his eyes, a smudge of grease on his cheek, a quiet strength that was almost invisible. He saw the tired, pragmatic man he had become, but sometimes, for a fleeting second, he'd see the younger Hank, the one who'd gone to vocational school with a spark in his eye, who'd imagined running his own small shop one day, crafting things with his hands from start to finish. That younger man had had ambition, a hunger for something more than just turning bolts. He'd envisioned a life where he truly built something, not just assembled someone else's design. That quiet ambition had been carefully packed away, stored like an old photo album in the attic of his mind, brought out only in the dead of night, or when he saw a particularly well-made piece of furniture in a store or the intricate workings of a clock. Each time the thought would come, what if? And each time it was quickly followed by the familiar refrain, don't be foolish, Hank. You have a good job, a stable job, a family to feed. He wanted better for Emily and Daniel, a life where they didn't have to count every penny, where opportunity felt like a wide-open field, not a narrow path hemmed in by caution. Yet he realized with a pang he was modeling the exact opposite. He was the king of the good deal, the safe bet, the known quantity. He'd been playing it safe for so long, he wasn't sure he remembered how to take a real chance. The fear wasn't just of failure. It was the fear of losing what he had, the security he'd painstakingly built, however modest it might be. That fear clung to him like the metallic dust in the factory air, settling deep into his clothes, his skin, his very bones. It was his shadow, his constant companion, reminding him always to stay on the straight and narrow, even if that path felt like a slow, steady drift away from the man he truly wanted to be. The notice went up on the breakroom corkboard, innocently enough between a faded flyer for a company picnic and a handwritten note about a lost set of keys. The Enhanced Flexibility Initiative, it was called, a mouthful of corporate speak for a new shift system. They were selling it hard. 4 10-hour shifts, slightly higher hourly rate, a bump in benefits. On paper, it looked like a win. More money was always good, Hank thought, a little extra buffer for Emily's college fund, maybe finally replace that worn-out transmission in the old pickup. He'd seen plenty of good deals come and go at the factory, and usually he just folded them into his life, another adjustment in the long list of adjustments that came with being Hank. But then he read the fine print. The rotation. Nights one week, days the next, then a swing to a split shift, and worst of all, weekends swallowed whole in a chaotic, unpredictable pattern. His stomach tightened. He could already picture Susan's face, etched with the familiar strain of trying to navigate a family schedule that changed faster than the weather. The real gut punch came a week later. Emily had been buzzing about the spring musical for months. She was only a tree, she declared proudly, but she was a very important tree, center stage, right next to the lead. The date for her performance had been circled in bright pink on the kitchen calendar since January. It was a Friday night. His new Friday night under the Enhanced Flexibility Initiative would be spent in the deafening drone of the factory's night shift, tightening bolts on an assembly line that cared nothing for teenage daughters or their stage debuts. At dinner that night, Emily's voice was full of bright, nervous energy as she recounted a particularly difficult rehearsal. And then Mrs. Henderson said I needed to really feel like a tree, Dad, you know, like my roots were deep. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and a young person's desperate hope for validation. You'll be there, right? You promised. Hank felt a cold dread settle in his chest. He looked across the table at Susan. Her eyes met his, and he saw the silent understanding, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. She knew the new schedule. She knew the date. Her concern wasn't voiced, but it was there in the slight downturn of her lips, in the way her hand rested almost protectively on Daniel's shoulder. Emily deserved to have her dad in the audience, not because it would change the world, but because it meant the world to her. And Susan deserved a partner, not a phantom who floated in and out of their lives according to a corporate spreadsheet. He offered a weak, forced smile to Emily. Of course, Sweet Pea wouldn't miss it. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew deep down that with the new shift he would miss it. He'd miss a lot of things. He'd been so focused on the extra cash, on the good deal on paper, that he'd glossed over the cost to the very reason he worked so hard. It wasn't just a schedule change. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of what little time he had with the people who mattered most. He saw himself trapped, caught in the invisible gears of a life he'd built on good enough, and for the first time he felt a desperate, clawing need to break free. That night, 3:17 a.m., the digital clock on his nightstand glowed a stark, unforgiving red, a small, malevolent eye in the darkness. Sleep was a cruel joke tonight, mocking him with its absence. Hank lay there, staring at the ceiling, the familiar shadows playing tricks on the plaster. His side of the bed was silent, a stark contrast to Susan's soft, even breathing beside him. He could hear the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant howl of a lone dog, sounds of a world continuing, oblivious to the turmoil raging within him. What had he become? The question echoed in the cavern of his skull, stripped bare of all the usual deflections and excuses. He was a man who let life happen to him, not for him. He was a cog in a machine, not just at the factory, but in his own life. A cog in the good deal machine, meticulously performing his assigned function, always prioritizing stability over spirit, caution over courage. He thought of the ambition he'd buried, the dreams he'd tucked away in the attic of his mind. They felt like ghosts now, whispering reproaches. The metallic dust of the factory, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just on his clothes, on his skin. It had settled into his soul, dimming the light, dulling the edges of who he truly was. Good enough. That phrase had been his comfort, his mantra, his excuse. It had kept him safe, paid the bills, put food on the table. But now, in the unforgiving silence of the night, it felt like the bars of a cage, locking him away from the very things he was working so hard to protect. His family, his own sense of worth, a cold knot formed in his stomach, spreading a chill through his limbs. It wasn't just disappointment about missing Emily's play, it was a sickening dread. He was afraid. Afraid of changing, afraid of the unknown, afraid of losing what little security he had. But even more terrifying was the thought of staying the same, of watching his life slowly, steadily become a shadow of what it could be, simply because he was too afraid to step away from something that was merely good. The cost of good enough was beginning to feel far too high. That gnawing dread wasn't just a feeling, it was a premonition. It crystallized a week later, stark and undeniable in the fluorescent glare of the factory's break room. Mr. Henderson, the plant manager, a man whose smile always looked like he was gritting his teeth, stood before them, a newly printed memo clutched in his hand. "All right, folks," Henderson boomed, his voice echoing a little too cheerfully off the cinderblock walls. "Got some good news for you all. Management's approved a new shift system. It's a win-win, really." Hank felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Win-win usually meant management won twice and the workers just worked, but then Henderson laid it out. The new FlexiFlow system. Higher base pay, a bump in the health benefits package, even a slightly better 401k match, all of it contingent on taking the new rotating night shift schedule. It meant 3 weeks on nights, then a week on days, then back to nights. A perpetual twilight existence designed to maximize machine uptime. On paper, it looked like a no-brainer. More money in the bank, more security. Another layer of insulation against the constant drip of bills and the nagging worry of unexpected repairs. His mind, conditioned by decades of good enough, immediately started tallying the positives. That old water heater was grumbling. Emily's college fund was looking mighty thin. Daniel needed new cleats. It was a good deal, maybe even a great deal in the eyes of his pragmatic, cautious self. Then Henderson started talking about the shifts. One of the rotations would see Hank working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday, for 3 solid weeks. No weekends off. Not for a while anyway. The words hit him like a cold splash of water. His heart sank, a heavy stone dropping into his gut. That specific rotation. That exact block of time. It clashed brutally and completely with the spring musical at Emily's high school. She'd been practicing for months, singing show tunes in her room until Susan had to gently tap on the wall. She had a small but crucial part, a solo even. He promised her months ago that he'd be there, front row. He could still picture the way her eyes had lit up when he'd confirmed it, the easy smile she'd given him, a rare, unburdened look on a teenager's face. That simple promise, given so easily then, now felt like a lead weight. He stood there numb as other guys around him murmured about the extra cash, the improved benefits. Some of them looked excited, already calculating what the extra $50 a week could do. Hank just felt a strange disconnect. The numbers were good, the security was tempting. But the price felt like it was written in invisible ink, a cost that wasn't on the company's ledger. He walked home that evening, the factory dust heavier than usual on his clothes. He could feel it in his soul, too, a grit that chafed against something soft and vulnerable inside him. Susan met him at the door, her eyes immediately scanning his face. She didn't need words. She knew Henderson had been making announcements. "It's the new shift, isn't it?" she asked, her voice quiet, already knowing the answer. Hank just nodded, dropping his lunch pail on the small table by the door with a thud. He sat down on the worn armchair, his shoulders slumped. "It's a good deal, Sue. More money, better benefits." He listed the positives, trying to convince himself as much as her. Susan sat opposite him, not pressing, just watching. Her silence was louder than any argument. "What about Emily's play?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, staring at a scuff mark on his work boot. I don't know, Sue. That rotation, it hits right in the middle of it." He didn't have to say anything else. He saw the shift in her eyes. Not anger, not even disappointment, just a profound, weary understanding. A quiet concern that spoke volumes about the sacrifices they'd made, were making, and would continue to make for good deals. He knew she saw past the numbers, past the benefits. She saw the man in front of her, tired, trapped, and slowly, irrevocably, slipping away from the family he worked so hard to provide for. Her worry was a mirror, reflecting his own unspoken fear. Later that evening, when he finally told Emily, she didn't rage. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, her beautiful, bright eyes clouding over. "Oh," she said, a small, deflated sound. I really wanted you to see it, Dad." Her voice trailed off, and she turned away, walking back to her room, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any shout. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the quiet acceptance of yet another broken promise, another small sacrifice on the altar of his good-enough life. That night, sleep didn't come. Hank lay awake, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, the digital clock on the nightstand glowing a relentless 3:17 a.m. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant, almost imperceptible sigh of the old furnace kicking on. Each sound felt amplified, a harsh reminder of the home he was supposedly protecting, the family he was sacrificing for. He got up, careful not to wake Susan, and padded into the living room. He sat in his worn armchair, the one that perfectly contoured to his tired frame, the one where he usually found a few minutes of peace before the grind began again. Tonight there was no peace, only a brutal, unflinching honesty. What had he become? He saw a ghost of himself in the dark reflection of the window. A provider, yes. A dependable man, certainly. But also a man who was fading, growing indistinct around the edges. A man who was letting life happen to him, letting the current carry him wherever it went, so long as it didn't rock the boat too much. The image of Emily's face, that small, crushed, "Oh," burned behind his eyelids. It wasn't just a missed play. It was another brick in a wall he was unknowingly building between himself and his kids, between himself and Susan, between himself and himself. He had always chosen the path of least resistance, the comfortable compromise, the good deal that kept things stable. But what was stability worth if it meant losing the very things you were trying to stabilize? He thought of the metallic dust, not just on his clothes, but in his soul. It was dulling him, making him accept less, making him okay with being a ghost in his own life. The factory was slowly consuming him, one good deal at a time, until there wouldn't be much left of Hank, the man who dreamed, the man who wanted more than just to get by. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his palms against them as if to squeeze out the painful truth. He was trapped. Caught between the fear of the unknown, the terrifying thought of stepping away from the only security he knew, and the even more terrifying realization that staying where he was meant slowly, silently, losing everything that truly mattered. The good deal had become a gilded cage, and he was the one who had meticulously built it, brick by cautious brick. And at 3:17 a.m., in the quiet darkness of his living room, Hank knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't stay in that cage anymore. He just didn't know how to get out. The morning light, thin and watery, began to seep through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the worn carpet. Hank didn't move. He sat there, hunched on the couch, the echoes of his internal battle swirling around him. He didn't have a grand plan. No escape route etched out on a napkin, no secret savings account. All he had was that bone-deep certainty. No more. The word wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, a quiet settling of dust inside him. Enough. Enough of the good deals that slowly chipped away at his spirit. Enough of prioritizing stability over everything else, only to find the foundation of that stability, his family, his own sense of self, cracking under the pressure. Didn't know what out looked like, but he knew what in felt like, and he couldn't stomach it another day. This wasn't about making a better deal. It was about refusing a bad one disguised as good. Later that morning, the factory hummed with its usual indifferent drone. Foreman Jenkins, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a grimace, called him over. "Hank, about that new shift. We're getting the schedules finalized today. You're in for the power shift, 2 p.m. to midnight. Extra 70 cents an hour, good benefits package. You're set, old man." He slapped Hank on the shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to convey camaraderie but mostly felt like being tagged for a duty roster. Hank looked at Jenkins, then passed him to the clatter and grind of the assembly line. He saw the dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light, the same dust that was clinging to his lungs, his heart. He thought of Emily's missed play, Daniel's quiet disappointment, Susan's strained smile. He thought of himself, aged beyond his years, constantly calculating, always just getting by, always accepting good enough. "Jenkins," Hank said, his voice surprisingly steady, though his gut churned. "I can't take that shift." Jenkins blinked, his grimace deepening. "What, are you deaf, Hank? I just said it's the power shift, extra pay." "I heard you." Hank replied, meeting the foreman's gaze. "It's a good deal, I know, but I can't do it, not anymore." Silence. The factory noise seemed to recede, leaving only the buzzing in Hank's ears. Other workers glanced over, sensing a disruption in the force. Jenkins stared at him, jaw slack, trying to process this unprecedented defiance from dependable, predictable Hank. "You serious?" Jenkins finally scoffed, recovering. "You know what that means, right? You turn down this preferred shift, you go to the back of the line. You'll get whatever's left. Probably graveyard, probably lower pay, less benefits maybe." His tone was laced with an implied threat, a warning that Hank was stepping off the comfortable, albeit stifling path. Hank swallowed. Every fiber of his being screamed to take the easy way out, to nod, to accept, to say, "Just kidding, Jenkins, put me down." The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, spreading. He had no safety net, no grand vision, just a gut feeling that saying yes to this good deal was saying no to everything else that mattered. "I understand," Hank said, the words feeling heavy on his tongue but strangely liberating. "I'll take whatever's left." Jenkins shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and irritation on his face. "All right, your funeral, Hank. Don't come crying to me when you're stuck on third shift, sweeping floors, and your pay stub looks like a grocery list." He turned away, muttering, "Crazy old fool." Hank stood there for a moment, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He hadn't just turned down a shift, he'd pushed away a good deal, the kind he'd always grabbed with both hands. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. He felt lighter somehow, even as the immediate future looked undeniably bleaker. He didn't know what he was walking towards, but he knew, deep in his bones, that for the first time in a long time, he was walking away from something that was actively pulling him down. And that, in itself, felt like a first step toward real freedom. When the new schedule was posted a few days later, his name was indeed on the graveyard shift, cleaning the very machines he used to operate for barely above minimum wage. The pay cut was immediate and sharp. His stomach dropped when he saw the numbers. This was the cost of walking away from good. This was the hard truth of choosing something undefined over something secure. It was a kick in the teeth. But as he looked at the schedule, a faint, almost imperceptible line appeared around his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it wasn't the usual resigned frown either. It was the face of a man who, for the first time, felt like he was truly making his own choices, even if those choices initially led him into the darkness. He had finally opened the cage door, and now he had to learn to fly, or at least, how to walk on new ground. The first week on the graveyard shift was a fog. Hank felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He'd leave for work when the stars were out, clean until dawn broke gray over the factory's corrugated roof, then stumble home as the neighborhood kids waited for their school bus. He'd sleep while Susan and the kids were living their day, waking up just as the sun dipped, only to repeat the cycle. The house, usually a hubbub of noise and life, felt unnaturally quiet to him. He was out of sync. His body ached in new ways. Not the familiar ache of lifting heavy components, but a dull, systemic fatigue that seeped into his bones. His mind, accustomed to the focused rhythm of production, now drifted in the monotonous hum of the industrial floor buffer or the solitary squeak of a mop across concrete. He cleaned oil spills, swept metal shavings, disinfected breakroom tables, and scrubbed toilets. The very machines he'd once operated, he now polished their grimy exteriors, a bitter irony that gnawed at him. One particularly brutal morning, as he was scrubbing a clogged drain in the men's room, a wave of self-pity, cold and slimy like the muck he was clearing, washed over him. His knuckles were raw, his back screamed, and the smell of stale urine was clinging to his clothes. "This is it, Hank," a voice whispered in his head, cold and mocking. This is what you traded for a good deal. This is your great escape. He squeezed his eyes shut, a sharp pain behind them. He remembered Emily's face, Susan's quiet worry. He remembered the suffocating feeling of being trapped. But right then, trapped felt warm, familiar, and paid a hell of a lot more. The paychecks were a constant, grim reminder. Every 2 weeks, the numbers on the stub were a stark testament to his choice. Susan, bless her steady heart, never complained, not once. But he saw the tighter budgeting, the way she'd pause a little longer in the grocery aisle, the quick, almost imperceptible shake of her head when Emily asked about new shoes. He felt the weight of it every time Daniel innocently asked why they weren't going out for pizza anymore. Hank would just say, "Dad's trying out a new plan, buddy. It's an investment." He hoped it was true. There were moments, many of them, when the factory's main shift would be letting out as he was clocking in. He'd see faces he knew, men he'd worked alongside for 20 years. Some would nod, a few would offer a quick, rough break Hank, but most just looked away, pity mixed with a hint of relief that it wasn't them. Their faces, though tired, still carried the imprint of a day spent building, creating. His, he knew, carried the grimace of a man who'd been cleaning up after them. The temptation to just walk back in, to beg for his old job, his old life, was a knot in his gut. It was a good deal, wasn't it? Stable, dependable. He could call Charlie, tell him he'd made a mistake, swallowed his pride. He knew Charlie liked him, valued his steady hand. He could be back on the assembly line in a week. The thought was a siren song, promising comfort and an end to the grinding exhaustion. He even drove past Charlie's house one evening, engine idling, the old Ford feeling like a conspirator in his weakness. He saw the lights on, heard faint laughter. He imagined the conversation, the relief of giving up. But then Emily's school play flashed in his mind, the way her shoulders had slumped when he told her he couldn't make it to rehearsals anymore because of the new good deal shift. The memory of that look was a sharp kick, pulling him back from the brink. No, not this time. He had traded a good deal for the chance at something better, and better didn't start with crawling back. It started with getting up, even when every fiber of his being screamed to quit. It started with gritting his teeth and pushing the mop again across the factory floor, remembering why he'd done it in the first place. He had made a promise to himself, a quiet, unspoken vow that good enough wouldn't define his family's future anymore. And Hank, if nothing else, was a man who kept his promises, even the ones to himself. The weeks that followed were a peculiar blend of grueling routine and quiet, focused urgency. Hank still rose before dawn, the chill of the morning seeping into his bones as he walked to the bus stop for his cleaning shift. His back ached from scrubbing, his hands were raw from industrial detergents. He smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale sweat. But something had started to change inside him. It was subtle at first, like the first hint of warmth after a long winter. In the evenings, after showering off the day's grime and eating Susan's usually simple but always nourishing dinner, he'd pull out the HVAC manuals. The pages were slick with diagrams, dense with technical jargon he hadn't known existed a month ago. He'd sit at the worn kitchen table, a chipped coffee mug steaming beside him, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet house once Susan and the kids were asleep. Sometimes his eyes would blur, the words swimming into an indistinguishable mess. Sometimes he'd fight the urge to just push it all away and crawl into bed, let the exhaustion claim him. But then he'd remember Emily's face. He'd remember the silent worry in Susan's eyes, and he'd press on. He started to see patterns, to understand the flow of refrigerant, the logic of electrical circuits. He'd sketch diagrams on scrap paper, mutter terms under his breath. Susan would often find him still there when she came for water in the middle of the night, a faint smile on her tired face. She'd just set a fresh cup of coffee beside him, a silent testament to her belief. It was Daniel, his youngest, who first noticed the change, though he couldn't put a finger on it. "Dad," he'd said one Saturday morning, watching Hank meticulously fix a leaky faucet in the bathroom, a task that once would have been met with a grunt and a promise, too. "Get to it later. You seem different." Hank just grunted again, but this time there was a spark in his eyes, not defeat. He was learning, doing. He wasn't just reacting to life anymore. He was building something with his own two hands, piece by piece, schematic by schematic. His quiet determination started to radiate. At work, the cleaning supervisor, a gruff ex-Marine named Mac, started leaving him slightly more complex tasks, almost tests. Hank tackled them without complaint, fixing a stuck floor buffer or diagnosing a problem with the ventilation in a rarely used storeroom. Mac, a man who rarely offered praise, began giving him a nod of approval, a flicker of respect in his usually stern eyes. Hank, for his part, was starting to walk with a different kind of purpose. The fear, that constant, nagging shadow of "what if I fail?" hadn't vanished entirely, but it had shrunk. It was no longer a towering wall, but a hurdle he knew he could clear. He wasn't just Hank from the assembly line anymore. He was Hank, the man who was learning HVAC. He was Hank, the man who was building a future, not just accepting a present. He started to see the world not just as a series of obligations, but as a series of challenges he could meet. The world hadn't changed, not really, but Hank had. And with that shift, hope, real, tangible hope, began to bloom in the quiet corners of his life. Then came the day he saw the ad. A local HVAC company was looking for apprentices, someone willing to learn the trade from the ground up. He'd studied every night for months, practiced on every broken appliance he could get his hands on. He felt the familiar knot of apprehension, the echo of his old self whispering, "It's a long shot, Hank. Don't embarrass yourself." But he looked down at his calloused hands, hands that had cleaned factory floors but had also meticulously traced wiring diagrams, hands that had felt the satisfying click of a pipe falling into place. He thought of Emily, of Daniel, of Susan's unwavering support. He was ready. He filled out the application that evening, his handwriting steady, his decision firm. The interview was nerve-wracking. He sat across from a man named Mr. Peterson, who looked like he'd been working with pipes and furnaces his whole life. Hank didn't have much formal experience, he admitted, but he told Mr. Peterson about the manuals, about the late nights, about the cleaning job and the problem-solving it often entailed. He talked about his years at the factory, the dedication, the reliability. He didn't just tell him he was a hard worker. He showed him through the story of the past months. He told him he wanted to build something real for himself, for his family. He wasn't asking for charity, he was offering a promise of unwavering effort. Mr. Peterson listened, his gaze unblinking. Hank walked out feeling like he'd left a piece of his soul on that chair, convinced he'd blown it. A week later, the phone rang. It was Mr. Peterson. They were impressed, he said. They saw his drive, they wanted him. The pay was a little more than his cleaning job, but less than his old factory wages, at least to start. But it offered real growth, a future. Hank accepted without a second's hesitation. The relief was a wave washing over him, leaving him lightheaded. He hung up the phone, a broad, genuine smile spreading across his face, a smile that hadn't reached his eyes in years. He told Susan that night, his voice thick with emotion. She just hugged him tight, burying her face in his shoulder. Later at dinner, he announced it to Emily and Daniel. Emily, who was now rehearsing for another play, looked at him with shining eyes, a real pride in her gaze. Daniel cheered, already imagining Dad fixing their broken air conditioner. The dinner table, usually a place for quiet sustenance, felt lighter, filled with a new kind of energy. The first few weeks at the HVAC company were tough. He was the oldest apprentice, often covered in grease, asking what felt like 100 stupid questions a day. But he learned. He observed. He absorbed every scrap of knowledge, staying late, volunteering for extra work. He learned to trust his hands, his mind, his instincts. He saw how the complex systems worked, how to diagnose problems, how to bring warmth or cool relief to people's homes. He wasn't just turning a wrench, he was providing comfort, solving problems. He was skilled, weeks turned into months. The pay increased with his skill. He wasn't just making ends meet, he was getting ahead. He started taking Emily to her rehearsals, watching her shine on stage, his heart swelling with a quiet joy he hadn't thought possible. He coached Daniel's little league team, yelling encouragement from the sidelines, feeling the sun on his face. Family dinners became sacred, filled with laughter and stories, not just silent meals eaten under the shadow of bills and exhaustion. He'd drive past the old factory sometimes, the massive building a monument to his past. He didn't feel resentment or bitterness. He felt something else. A deep, quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the good deal he'd walked away from because that decision had forced him, kicked him, dragged him into a future he would never have dared to dream of before. He had learned that good enough was a cage, often disguised as comfort, and that sometimes the hardest thing you ever do is open that cage door, not knowing what's on the other side. But if you have the courage to step out to take that risk, the rewards can be immeasurable. The quiet strength Hank always carried was now different. It wasn't the strength of endurance, of just getting through. It was the strength of purpose, vibrant and clear. His mornings, once colored by the dread of the assembly line, now hummed with a different energy. He'd often wake before the alarm, a quiet eagerness in his chest. Making coffee, he'd sometimes catch Susan, sharing a comfortable silence or low conversation about the kids, about plans. The worry lines etched around her eyes had softened, replaced by a glimmer of the easy affection they'd once shared. She'd look at him across the kitchen table, her gaze full of a quiet pride, a relaxed